The snow was falling the night. A 7-year-old girl put on a coat with a broken zipper, picked up her backpack, and walked alone through the dark to knock on the door of the most powerful man she had never been told existed. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She simply stood on that porch in the cold and said 6 words that would unravel years of buried secrets, corporate crimes, and a truth that 2 people had spent nearly a decade running from. Zuri Bennett was 7 years old, and she had no idea that the man who opened that door was not just her mother's boss. But some doors, once knocked on, cannot be closed again, and what waited on the other side of this one would shake a powerful empire to its foundation. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The snow had been falling since early evening, soft and steady, the kind that muffles the world until all you can hear is your own heartbeat. The streets of the residential neighborhood were empty at this hour, past 10, past the time when decent people were still moving around outside. Porch lights glowed yellow through the white curtain of falling flakes, and driveways sat buried under 2 inches of fresh powder that nobody had gotten around to shoveling yet. A small figure moved along the sidewalk. She walked carefully, each step deliberate, her thin winter coat doing almost nothing against the cold. The coat was navy blue with a broken zipper, and she'd pulled the front edges together with one fist, holding them closed as she walked. Her other hand gripped the strap of a small backpack. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her braids were coming loose, and her breath made small white clouds in the frozen air. Zuri Bennett knew exactly where she was going. She had memorized the address from the company directory on her mother's laptop 3 weeks ago, not because she planned to use it, but because she was the kind of child who stored information the way other kids stored candy. Quietly, privately, just in case. Tonight, just in case had arrived. She turned on Elmwood Drive and counted houses the way her mother had taught her to count everything, methodically, without rushing. The homes here were large and well-kept, set back from the street behind old oak trees whose bare branches collected snow like outstretched arms. This was a neighborhood that existed in a completely different world from their 2-bedroom apartment on Clover Street, and Zuri understood that difference without anyone having to explain it to her. She understood a lot of things that people assumed she didn't. The house at 42, Elmwood Drive, had a wide front porch with stone columns and a single lamp burning beside the door. No Christmas lights. No these. Just that one lamp burning like it was waiting for something. Zuri walked up the front path, up the 3 porch steps, and rang the doorbell. She heard movement inside almost immediately. Heavy footsteps, unhurried, the kind that belonged to someone who expected to be annoyed by whoever was on the other side of the door. A lock turned, then another. The door swung open. Ethan Calloway stood in the frame, taller than she'd expected, dressed in a dark sweater and slacks like he'd been sitting in his home office working late, which he had been. His expression carried the particular irritation of a man who didn't get unexpected visitors and didn't appreciate being the exception. He was already drawing breath to speak when his eyes landed on her face. This small, freezing, impossibly composed little girl standing on his porch in the snow, and everything in him stopped. For a moment, neither of them said anything. She looked up at him with dark eyes that held a steadiness far too old for her face, and he looked down at her with an expression that shifted, in real time, from irritation to confusion to something that wasn't quite either of those things. Something that looked, if you were watching closely, a great deal like dread. "Sir," Zuri said quietly, her voice even and clear despite the cold. "My mom didn't wake up." The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds. Ethan Calloway, who ran a corporation with 4,000 employees, who had sat across negotiating tables from some of the sharpest people in the industry, who prided himself on never being caught off guard, went completely still. Then he crouched down to her level. His whole tone changed. The irritation was gone. Something careful and urgent replaced it, and his eyes searched her face with an intensity that had nothing to do with a CEO looking at an employee's child. It went deeper than that, though he would not have been able to say exactly how or why. Not in that moment. Not yet. "Show me now," he said. They rode in his car through the empty, snowed-in streets. Zuri sitting in the back seat with her backpack in her lap, watching the streetlights pass. Ethan drove faster than the conditions allowed, but his hands were steady on the wheel. He asked her questions in a calm, measured voice. What time did she notice? Had she tried to wake her? Had anyone else been in the apartment? And Zuri answered each one with the same quiet precision she'd brought to his doorstep. Their apartment building on Clover Street was a 5-story brick structure with a buzzing overhead light in the lobby that had been broken for 6 months. Ethan followed Zuri through the front door, up 2 flights of stairs, and down a hallway that smelled like radiator heat and someone's dinner from earlier in the evening. Apartment 2C. Zuri pushed the door open. She left it unlocked when she left, she explained, because she couldn't lock it from the outside with her key and she didn't want to be locked out, and Ethan stepped inside. The apartment was small, but it was not careless. There were books stacked neatly on shelves, a child's drawings pinned to the kitchen wall with color magnets, a dish rack with 2 plates and 2 cups drying beside the sink. Someone lived here with intention. Someone worked hard to make this place feel like more than what it was. Evelyn Bennett lay in the bedroom, on top of the covers, still dressed in the clothes she'd worn that day. Dark slacks, a cream-colored blouse. Her work badge still clipped to her collar. She looked like she had simply sat down on the edge of the bed and fallen backward, except she was too still. The kind of still that wasn't sleep. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, slow increments, but she could not be roused. Zuri had tried for 20 minutes before she'd put on her coat and left. Ethan stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at Evelyn for a long moment. His jaw was tight. Something moved behind his eyes that he kept carefully contained. "She was scared last night," Zuri said from beside him. Her voice was soft but certain. "I heard her on the phone. She kept walking around the kitchen. She does that when something's wrong." He turned to look at the child. "What time did she go to bed?" "Early. Like 8:30. She said she was tired." Zuri paused. "But she never goes to bed at 8:30. Ethan moved into the room and crouched beside the bed, looking at Evelyn more carefully. No visible injuries. No obvious signs of anything. But something was wrong. It sat in the air of the room like a smell you couldn't quite identify. He looked at the nightstand. A glass of water, half finished. A book, open face down. A phone charger, plugged in, but no phone. "Mom hid her phone before she went to sleep," Zuri said from the doorway. She said it the way she said most things, like a fact being filed. "I saw her put it somewhere, but I don't know where. And now it's not anywhere I looked." Ethan checked the nightstand drawer. Empty. He checked under the pillow, under the mattress edge. He got down on one knee and looked under the bed, and what he found wasn't the phone. It was a necklace. A thin gold chain, snapped in two, the clasp broken. He picked it up and turned it over in his fingers, and his hand stopped moving. He recognized it. He knew exactly where it came from and what it meant, and the color drained slowly from his face in the dim light of the bedroom. He closed his fingers around it and said nothing. He called 911. While they waited, Ethan sat in the kitchen and pulled out his own phone. He had emergency access to the company's server. All executives did, a security feature implemented after a ransomware scare 2 years prior. He navigated to Evelyn's work email account with the access credentials, telling himself he was looking for any indication of what might have happened, whether she'd received any kind of threat, whether anything at work had escalated. What he found instead was a draft. It sat in her drafts folder, unsent, time-stamped 3 days ago. The subject line was blank. The body read, "If anything happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Please look at what I've attached." The attachment was encrypted. He couldn't open it from his phone, but the file name was a long string of numbers that meant nothing on its own, except that it was clearly deliberate. Someone who wanted to hide the file name while still preserving the file. He sat with his phone in his hand and stared at the screen for a long time. The paramedics arrived 11 minutes later. 2 of them, a man and a woman, efficient and professional, as they moved into the bedroom and began their assessment. Ethan stood in the hallway with Zuri beside him. She found his hand at some point without either of them acknowledging it. Her small fingers wrapped around 2 of his, and he watched them work. The female paramedic asked which hospital she worked at, routine intake question, and Ethan answered, Callaway Technologies. The company, not a hospital. The woman glanced at her partner, just briefly, a flicker of something that passed between them before either of them remembered to keep their faces neutral. The male paramedic muttered it under his breath, barely audible, probably not meant to carry. Another one? Ethan heard it. He said nothing, but he heard it. Across the room, Zuri had let go of his hand and settled herself into the small chair in the corner of the living room. Her chair, the one with the worn armrest that she'd clearly sat in 1,000 times before. She had taken something out of her backpack, a folded piece of paper. She smoothed it on her knee and looked at it, and her face was very still. Ethan crossed the room to her. He looked down at the drawing. It was done in colored pencil. Careful, detailed in the way children's drawings are detailed when the child takes them seriously. 3 figures. One small, with braids. One taller, a woman. And a third figure, the tallest, who had no face. Just a blank oval where the face should have been. Above the faceless figure, in large, careful letters, a 7-year-old had written 2 words. He knows. Ethan stared at it. Zuri looked up at him. She didn't explain it, and he didn't ask. Detective Rowan Hale arrived 20 minutes after the paramedics. He came in through the front door with the quiet authority of someone who had walked into 100 rooms like this one and always noticed the same things the other people in the room had missed. He was lean, late 30s, with a slightly rumpled look that didn't match how sharp his eyes were. He took in the room in about 4 seconds. The paramedics in the bedroom, the child in the chair, Ethan standing near the window. He looked at Ethan for a long moment. Then he said pleasantly, "Interesting. You got here before emergency services." "I live close," Ethan said. Hale didn't write anything down yet. "You often check on your employees at home this time of night?" "She's more than an employee." Hale tilted his head slightly. "That's an interesting answer." The tension in the room settled between them like something physical. Zuri watched from her chair. She had folded her drawing and put it back in her backpack. At the hospital, the news got worse in the specific way that bad news has of becoming more precise as time goes on. Evelyn wasn't simply unresponsive from exhaustion or medical episode. The toxicology results from the initial blood work came back inside 2 hours, flagged as urgent. The attending physician pulled Ethan aside in the hallway. He'd identified himself as her emergency contact, which nobody had yet questioned, which said something about the authority he carried without even trying, and explained in careful, clinical language that Evelyn's system contained traces of a sedative compound. Not a common one. Not something you bought at a pharmacy or found in a medicine cabinet. The kind of thing that required access and knowledge and intent. This wasn't random. That was the conclusion that settled in Ethan's chest like a stone and stayed there. He was sitting in the waiting area, processing that, when Zuri appeared beside him. She had been sitting with a nurse, coloring, supposedly distracted. She reached into her backpack, without preamble, and held something out to him. A flash drive. Small, black, unremarkable. "I found this under her pillow," she said, "before I left to come find you. I didn't know what it was, but I thought," she paused, "I thought maybe it was important." Ethan looked at it in her open palm. Something about his expression shifted in a way that Zuri would remember later. Not fear exactly, but the look of a man who had been hoping for a particular outcome and had just been told that hope was irrelevant now. He reached out and took it. The hospital had a small family consultation room on the second floor, a quiet space with 2 chairs and a window that looked out onto the snow-covered parking lot. Ethan sat there alone just after 2 in the morning, his laptop open, the flash drive plugged in. Zuri was asleep on a waiting room couch down the hall, a nurse's cardigan draped over her like a blanket. The drive was encrypted with a standard but solid cipher. It took Ethan 40 minutes and the help of a remote access connection to a company's server to break through it. When the files finally opened, he sat in the quiet room for a long time without moving, reading. The financial irregularities were not subtle once you knew what you were looking at. They were layered, built to be invisible inside the noise of a large corporation's normal transactions, the kind of thing that required either enormous luck or deliberate, sustained effort to uncover. Shell companies, offshore accounts registered in jurisdictions that asked very few questions, transfers that moved in amounts just below regulatory reporting thresholds, consistent, methodical, patient, and all of it traced back to a single authorization chain that ended at one set of signatures. Graham Pierce, CFO. Ethan sat back in his chair. There was more. Buried deeper in the files, past the financial records, were internal project documents. Project Helios. The name meant nothing to him at first. He scrolled through the pages, reading, and the nothing gradually became something cold and particular. Helios was an internal operation. It had its own budget line, its own personnel, its own network of contractors. It had been running for, he checked the dates twice, 4 years. For years, inside his company, funded through Graham's shell company network, and Ethan had never seen it, never been briefed on it. The operation documents bore his company's internal header and authorization codes. But he had never authorized this. He had never seen these documents before tonight. Or had someone used his name. He closed the laptop and pressed his knuckles against his mouth and stared at the dark window. The flashback came to him later as he walked the corridor back toward the waiting room. One of those involuntary memories that surface when you're tired and your defenses are low. Evelyn, 8 years ago. Not this Evelyn, not the composed, careful woman lying in a hospital bed down the hall, but the one he'd known before, younger, brighter in a way that was less guarded, working alongside him in the early days of a startup that had not yet become an empire. They'd worked late nights side by side over code reviews and pitch decks, building something from nothing, and the closeness of that kind of shared effort had become something else for a short time. Brief, complicated, and then she was gone. She'd resigned abruptly. No real explanation. One day she was there, the next day she wasn't, and the office had moved on because startups don't have the luxury of grieving their losses, and Ethan had moved on too, because that was what he did. He moved forward. He had always moved forward. He had not let himself think about why she might have left so suddenly. Not then, and not since. He was thinking about it now. At 7 in the morning, Graham Pierce walked into the hospital. He was dressed impeccably for 7 in the morning, which was itself a kind of statement. Dark suit, silver tie, shoes that clicked with authority on the hospital floor. He carried a small arrangement of flowers, tasteful, not extravagant, and his expression wore the precise composition of a concerned colleague. Not too distressed, not too composed, calibrated. Ethan watched him come down the hall from 20 feet away and kept his own face entirely still. Ethan, Graham's voice was warm, measured. I heard this morning. I came as soon as I could. He glanced toward the corridor that led to the ICU. How is she? Stable. Unconscious. God. Graham shook his head. Do they know what happened? They're still running tests. Of course. A small pause. You know, I've been concerned about Evelyn for some time. She seemed, he chose his words carefully, overextended. She'd been carrying a lot. There were some signs of strain that I'd noticed. Mental health struggles can manifest in ways that are very hard to. She was poisoned, Ethan said. The word landed between them like something dropped from a height. Graham's expression shifted. Not shock exactly, but a recalibration. The kind of recalibration that happens when a prepared script meets an unexpected variable. That's a significant claim, Graham said carefully. Toxicology confirmed it. Well, another pause. I'm sure the investigation will. I'm sure it will, Ethan said. Across the waiting room, Zuri had woken up. She was sitting up on the couch, the nurse's cardigan still around her shoulders, watching Graham with the focused stillness of a child who has learned to watch adults carefully because adults are where the useful information comes from. She said nothing. She just watched. And then, after Graham had excused himself to speak with someone at the nurse's station, Zuri got up and crossed the room to Ethan. She stood beside him and spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. He smells like the man from the hallway, she said. Ethan looked down at her. What man? Earlier this week, a man came to our building. I saw him in the hallway outside our apartment. He was just standing there. She thought about it. He had the same kind of smell, like that soap that comes in the fancy little hotel bottles. She paused again. Mom saw him too. She made me go inside. Ethan held very still. She made you go inside, he repeated. Zuri nodded. Her face was matter of fact. She was simply reporting a thing she had observed. But the thing she had observed was enormous. Detective Hale found Ethan an hour later in the corridor outside the ICU. Walk with me, Hale said, which wasn't quite a request. They walked. Hale kept his hands in his pockets and his eyes mostly forward, and he spoke in the conversational tone of someone discussing something inconsequential, which was a technique Ethan recognized and found professionally irritating. Your CFO just happened to show up at the hospital this morning, Hale observed. He mentioned he'd heard the news. From who? You're the one who's been here all night. You didn't call anyone. Hale glanjet si device. So either he has a source inside the hospital, or he had a reason to be monitoring the situation. Ethan said nothing. You're either protecting her, Hale said, or protecting yourself. I haven't worked out which one yet. He stopped walking. You should know that I'm going to work it out. I would expect nothing less. Hale looked at him for a long moment. Calloway, if you know something that's relevant to what happened to that woman, the time to say it is now. Not later. Not when I've already found it from another direction. He paused. Because I will find it. Ethan met his gaze. I know, he said. And I'm not protecting myself. Hale studied him. Nodded once. Walked away. Ethan found the building security office of Evelyn's apartment complex that afternoon. A small room on the ground floor occupied by an older gentleman named Harold who supervised a system of 4 cameras covering the building's entry points. He asked to review the footage from the previous 72 hours. Harold pulled it up on a monitor that had seen better years, and they watched together. The lobby camera, the parking lot camera, the rear entrance camera, all functioning normally, showing the routine traffic of a residential building. Ethan made note of timestamps, made note of faces that appeared more than once. Then Harold switched to the stairwell camera. That one's been glitchy, Harold said apologetically. On and off for about a week. Technician's been scheduled to look at it, but he hasn't made it in yet. The stairwell footage was indeed corrupted. Chunks of static, missing frames, the visual equivalent of a signal that keeps cutting out. Most of the 48-hour window was unviewable, but there were 4 seconds. 4 clear seconds in a 48-hour window of mostly static, caught at 11:47 p.m. 2 nights before Evelyn was found unresponsive. A figure entering the stairwell from a second-floor landing. Not enough to confirm identity. Not enough for a courtroom. But Ethan watched those 4 seconds 3 times, and the shape of the figure, the height, the build, the particular way the shoulders sat, was not a mystery to him. He didn't say what he saw to Harold. He requested a copy of the footage, gave a business card, and walked back out into the cold. He found an envelope that evening. The hospital had kept a small bag of Evelyn's personal effects. The things she'd had on her when the paramedics brought her in, cataloged and bagged, and sitting in a cabinet with her name on a label. A nurse brought it to him when he asked. Inside, her work badge, her apartment key, a small compact mirror, a folded receipt, and a sealed envelope. The envelope was plain, white, sealed with tape rather than the adhesive strip, the kind of sealing that a person does when they want to be certain it won't open accidentally. On the front, written in Evelyn's careful handwriting, was a single name. Ethan. He sat down in the consultation room again. The door closed behind him and turned the envelope over in his hands. He sat with it for a full minute before he opened it. The document inside was 3 pages. Official. Notarized. Dated 18 months ago. He read the cover page. He read it again. Then he sat very still for a long time, staring at the wall in front of him, while everything he thought he understood about the last 7 years rearranged itself around a single undeniable fact. The document was a paternity test. The subject was Zuri Naomi Bennett, age 7. The test had been conducted at an accredited laboratory, and the results were unambiguous. The probability figure at the bottom of the last page was printed in standard font, unremarkable in its typography, overwhelming in its implication. Zuri was his daughter. He had a 7-year-old daughter who had walked through a snowstorm alone to knock on his door, and until tonight he had not known she existed. He sat in that small room for a long time. Outside the window, the parking lot was quiet under its covering of snow, and the night pressed in at the glass. And somewhere down the hall, in a room he could not yet bring himself to go back to, a child who was his child was asleep on a waiting room couch. The snow was still falling. The hospital was quieter at dawn than it had any right to be, given everything pressing against its walls. Ethan had not slept. He sat in the consultation room with the paternity document on the table in front of him, the overhead light humming its small, indifferent hum, and he let himself do something he almost never permitted. He sat with a feeling without immediately converting it into a plan. He thought about 8 years ago, the startup, the late nights, Evelyn laughing at something he'd said about a particularly tortured pitch deck, the way that felt like sunlight in a room full of spreadsheets, the brief, quietly serious thing that had grown between them before it was over. He had told himself, afterward, that she'd left because startups burn people out, because the hours were unsustainable, because people move on. He had told himself a lot of things. He had not considered, had not let himself consider, that she might have been running from something, or protecting something, or someone. He looked at the name printed on the document. Zuri Naomi Bennett, age 7. He thought about her walking through the snow in a coat with a broken zipper. He thought about how she had found his hand in that hallway without making a thing of it, small fingers curling around his like it was the most natural thing in the world. He thought about her voice when she said she was scared last night. Matter of fact, like she'd already processed the fear and was simply reporting it because someone had to. He folded the document, put it in his jacket pocket, and went to find a private lab. He had results by early afternoon. He had known what they would say since the moment he'd read the envelope, but there was a difference between knowing and having it confirmed in black and white. And when he sat his car in the hospital parking structure and read the results off his phone screen, the difference made itself felt in his chest like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for years. Zuri was his. He sat there for 4 minutes. Then he got out of the car, straightened his jacket, and walked back inside. He found her in the small play corner near the pediatric waiting area. A volunteer had set her up with colored pencils and a fresh stack of paper, and she was drawing with total concentration, the tip of her tongue just visible at the corner of her mouth. She didn't look up when he sat down in the small chair across from her, the kind of chair designed for someone about a third of his size. He didn't say anything right away. He watched her draw, a house this time, with careful windows and a tree in the front yard that had leaves even though outside everything was bare and frozen. "How's it coming?" he said finally. "The tree's hard," she said, not looking up. "Trees look simple, but they're not." "No," he agreed. "They're not." She added a small figure standing in front of the house. Then another one, taller, beside it. She studied what she'd drawn. "Are they going to wake my mom up soon?" The question was direct and quiet, and it hit him somewhere undefended. "The doctors are working on it," he said. "They know what made her sick now. so they know what to do about it. That matters. Zuri considered this. She added a third figure to the drawing, very tall, standing on the other side of the smaller one. She didn't comment on it. She just drew it. Ethan watched the three figures standing in front of the careful house with the hard tree, and he made a decision. The board meeting convened at 2 in the afternoon with a notice period that was technically within bylaws, but practically speaking was designed to allow minimum preparation. Ethan knew this because he recognized the move. It was one he'd seen Graham use before on an external acquisition target, the kind of compression tactic that forced the other side to respond rather than initiate. He arrived first and sat at the head of the table. The other board members filed in over the next 10 minutes, 6 of them, ranging from genuinely concerned to carefully neutral to one. Harrison Webb, who studied inscrutability, meant he'd already been spoken to. Graham came in last, composed and unhurried, and settled into his chair with the ease of a man who believed the room was already arranged in his favor. "I'll be direct," Graham said, once the formalities were dispensed with. "Given the circumstances, the ongoing police investigation, Ethan's personal involvement with the employee in question, and several internal matters that have come to my attention, I believe we need to discuss a temporary suspension of executive authority, pending review." The words fell into the room with practiced smoothness. Ethan let them land. "Which internal matters?" he said. Graham opened a folder. "Certain financial authorizations that appear to originate from your office. Project-related expenditures that were not disclosed in the standard reporting cycle." He paused. "I want to be clear. This is about protecting the company while the facts are established." "Whose name is on those authorizations?" Ethan said, "Yours. And you're the one presenting them." "A beat. I'm presenting what the records show." Ethan looked around the table slowly, making eye contact with each person in turn. "I'm calling an immediate internal audit," he said. "Full scope. Independent auditors, not internal. Beginning with the Project Helios expenditures that were run through a network of shell companies linked to a CFO-level authorization chain." He paused. "And I'm not suspending anything." The temperature in the room changed. Graham's composure held. He was good. Ethan had always known that, but something tightened at the corner of his eyes. "That's your prerogative," Graham said carefully. "Yes," Ethan said. "It is." The news about Evelyn came at 4:15. A doctor called his cell while he was still in the building, stepping out of a terse hallway conversation with 2 of the board members who had pulled him aside after the meeting. He answered immediately. The sedation, the doctor explained, had been layered. Not a single dose, but a sequence of compounds administered over time, calibrated to maintain the comatose state and prevent natural metabolic clearance. This was not an accident and not a single act. Someone had planned for her to stay under. The doctor was careful with his language, but the implication was plain. This required access, expertise, and sustained effort. The kind of effort you put into making something look medical rather than criminal. Ethan thanked him and hung up and stood in the corridor for a moment with his hand still around his phone, and what he felt was not surprise. It was something colder and more clarifying than surprise. The incident in the hospital garden happened at 5:30. Zuri had been taken down to the enclosed courtyard by a child life specialist named Donna, who ran a daily 1-hour outdoor session for children staying long-term in the hospital or visiting sick family members. It was supervised, the garden was enclosed, and it was safe. Ethan had been told this and had accepted it, which he would second-guess for a long time afterward. A man appeared at the garden entrance at 5:47. He was dressed in a dark jacket, unremarkable, and he walked toward the group of children with the practiced casualness of someone who belongs somewhere and knows it. He crouched down near Zuri specifically, smiling, speaking quietly. Donna was across the courtyard with 2 other children. The man said he was a driver. He said her father had sent him to bring her inside. Zuri looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned and ran. She didn't scream. She ran, fast and direct, straight toward the hospital entrance doors, and she hit the push bar and came through into the lobby at a speed that alarmed the security guard near the entrance enough that he stepped forward, and she pointed back at the garden door and said clearly, "There's a man out there who said he was sent by my father, and nobody sent him." Security reached the garden in under 2 minutes. The man was gone. Ethan arrived at the lobby 90 seconds after that, having been called by the security desk. He crouched in front of Zuri and looked at her carefully. She was breathing harder than usual. That was all. No crying, no shaking, just elevated breathing. "You did exactly right," he said. She looked at him with those steady dark eyes. "I knew he was lying," she said. "Ow!" She thought about it. "He said my father sent him." A pause. "I don't have a father." Ethan held her gaze. His throat tightened in a way he didn't let become visible on his face. "You did exactly right," he said again, quietly. Detective Hale came to the hospital at 6 in the evening with the specific energy of a man who had spent the day pulling on threads and found that they kept producing more thread. He sat across from Ethan in the consultation room and put a folder on the table. 2 former Callaway Technologies employees, he said, both connected to a project referenced in internal documents as Helios. Both died in the last 3 years in separate incidents officially ruled accidental. He opened the folder. One fell from a parking structure in Denver. One had a fatal car accident on a mountain road in Vermont. He looked up. Evelyn Bennett is the 3rd person with a direct connection to this project to suffer a life-threatening incident. Ethan looked at the folder. She's not the first. No, Hale said. She is not. He closed it, which means she knew that. She knew the risk she was taking when she started gathering that evidence. He let that sit. She took it anyway. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The sedative in her system, Hale continued. Pharmaceutical grade, tight supply chain, not commercially available. My team is tracing the procurement. It's slow work because it's been deliberately obscured. He paused. But we found a shell company that made payments to a private pharmaceutical supplier. 3 payments over 8 months. He looked at Ethan steadily. The shell company traces back through 2 layers of incorporation to a parent entity that I am currently working to identify. How long? Ethan said. Days. Maybe less. Understood. In the meantime, I'd recommend ensuring that child doesn't go anywhere unaccompanied. She won't, Ethan said. Naomi Bennett arrived at the hospital at 7 in the evening, and she came in like someone who had been arguing with herself for a long time about whether to come at all, and had only just one. She was in her late 50s, with Evelyn's cheekbones and a wariness in her eyes that came from years of being let down by the same categories of people in the same categories of ways. She walked to the nurse's station and asked for her daughter's room, and she was directed to Ethan, who was in the waiting area with Zuri. She stopped when she saw him. Whatever she had planned to say rearranged itself. Mr. Callaway, she said. The temperature in her voice was unmistakable. Mrs. Bennett, he said. He stood. I'm glad you came. Are you? It wasn't a question. Zuri looked up from her drawing at the woman she clearly recognized, and something uncertain moved across her face. The look of a child encountering a relationship she knows is complicated but doesn't fully have the context for. Grandma Naomi, she said carefully. Naomi's expression changed entirely when she looked at Zuri. All the cold architecture of it dissolved. She sat down beside her granddaughter and pulled her into a hug that lasted long enough to say something about how long it had been, and Zuri allowed it, and over Naomi's shoulder her eyes found Ethan with the calm evaluation of a child taking notes. Later, when Zuri was asleep again and the hallway was quiet, Naomi sat with Ethan in the consultation room and said the things she'd come there carrying. My daughter spent years rebuilding something you helped destroy, she said. She was 21 years old when she walked away from that job, and she walked away with nothing except what she managed to protect on her own. She met his gaze without flinching. I need you to understand that before anything else gets said in this room. Understand it, Ethan said. Do you know why she left? He had spent the last 24 hours forming a theory, and it had hardened into near certainty. She found something, he said, illegal fund activity, and she was silenced. Naomi's jaw tightened. Paid off and threatened. Both. They made it very clear what would happen if she talked. She paused. She was 3 months pregnant when she signed whatever they put in front of her. She signed it because she didn't have any other way to keep herself and that baby safe. Her voice held steady, though the effort was visible. She never told you because the agreement required it, and because she didn't trust, she stopped. She didn't trust that you'd choose her over the company. The words landed honestly. Ethan didn't defend himself against them. She was gathering the evidence to undo it, he said. 8 years later, she came back and took a job in the company to get close enough to fix it, Naomi said. Yes, that's Evelyn. A pause. She's stubborn like that. 3 days had passed since the night Zuri knocked on the door, and the quiet order that Ethan had always maintained around himself was gone. His office had been searched. He discovered it when he arrived at Callaway Technologies headquarters at 7 in the morning to find his assistant, Claire, standing in the corridor outside his office with a look on her face that walked the line between apologetic and alarmed. An internal security review had been authorized overnight, she told him, citing a compliance protocol signed by the head of corporate security. A number of physical files had been removed for examination. Ethan walked into his office and stood in the middle of it and looked at the gaps on his shelves, the slightly disturbed alignment of objects on his desk, the empty cabinet that had held 7 years of physical records. Then he called his security chief. The call went to voicemail. Then again. The third time, a junior member of the security team answered and explained that James Whitfield, the security chief, 15-year employee, someone Ethan had trusted implicitly, had taken a personal leave of absence effective that morning. Ethan put the phone down. The inner circle was smaller than he'd thought. Naomi came to his office that afternoon, having spent the previous evening with Zuri at the hospital and apparently having decided, somewhere in the night, to say more than she'd said before. She sat across from him in the chair that faced his desk and folded her hands in her lap and told him what she'd been holding back. Years ago, around the time Evelyn left, Naomi herself had been approached. A representative she'd never seen before and never saw again sat at her living room and put an envelope on her coffee table and explained, in polite and perfectly clear terms, that would be in everyone's best interest for her daughter's departure from Callaway Technologies to remain exactly that, a departure. Quiet. Final. No public statements, no legal action, no communication with anyone connected to the company. Naomi had taken the envelope. She was not proud of it. She'd had her own bills, her own pressures, and Evelyn had already agreed to the terms, and Naomi had told herself it was the pragmatic choice. It wasn't Graham who paid me, she said. She looked at the desk surface rather than at Ethan. The representative said he was acting on behalf of someone above the CFO level. A pause. Those were his words. Above the CFO level. Ethan kept his face neutral. Inside, something clicked into a position it had been working toward since he'd first read the Helios files. Did he give a name? He said. No. She looked up. But the check was drawn from a personal account. I still have it. I kept it because she seemed briefly embarrassed. I suppose I thought someday it might matter. It matters now, Ethan said. The emergency board vote convened the following morning. Graham had done his work efficiently. Board sentiment had been shaped overnight with conversations Ethan had not been party to, and the meeting had the particular atmosphere of a decision that has already been made and is being enacted through procedural form for the sake of propriety. Graham presented his case with the measured fluency of a man who had prepared his testimony and was confident in his sources. Ethan, he argued, had authorized Project Helios personally, had created the offshore structure, had directed the expenditures, had done so while maintaining plausible deniability through a chain of intermediaries. The documents Graham laid before the board were detailed, consistent, and entirely convincing if you didn't know they were fabricated. Ethan watched the board members read through them. He watched their expressions shift in the direction Graham wanted them to shift. Then he said, I'd like to table the vote for 48 hours while the independent audit I've commissioned completes its initial findings. The audit was authorized by you, Graham said. Its objectivity is questionable under the circumstances. The firm conducting it was selected by legal counsel, not by me. Their retainer was signed before this meeting was called. Ethan looked at the board. 48 hours. If the documents Graham has presented are genuine, the audit will confirm them. He paused. If they're not, you want to know that before you vote. The vote to delay passed by one margin, which told Ethan exactly how many board members were still operating independently. Zuri had been brought to Ethan's office building that afternoon, under Hale's arrangement, a supervised space where security could be maintained more reliably than at the hospital. Donna from the Child Life program had come too, which helped. Zuri had been given a corner of a conference room with her colored pencils and a tablet loaded with educational games, and she appeared to take the transition in stride. Late in the afternoon, Ethan stopped in to check on her. She was alone for the moment, Donna having stepped out to take a phone call. Zuri was not playing the tablet games. She was looking at something. Ethan came around the conference table and saw that she'd found one of the built-in storage drawers on the far side of the table. The kind of drawer that blends into the furniture construction so seamlessly that most people who use the room don't know it exists. It was partially ajar. She hadn't opened it. It had apparently been left that way. Inside the drawer was a file. Not a digital file. Physical paper, document clipped, marked with an internal project header that Ethan recognized from Evelyn's flash drive. He reached past Zuri and lifted it out. The Helios contracts. Original copies, not the versions Graham had been circulating. He flipped to the signature pages. The name on the authorization line was not Graham Pierce. It was not Ethan Callaway. The name on every original contract, in firm, deliberate ink, was Victor Langston. Ethan stood in the conference room holding the file and felt the whole shape of the thing change around him. Victor Langston, founder of the company, the man who had recruited Ethan out of his startup, mentored him, elevated him, handed him the CEO position with the kind of theatrical generosity that made the transfer of power look like a gift rather than a calculation. The man who had stepped back in a quiet retirement and maintained, he claimed, no active role in operations. He had been here all along. Ethan called Detective Hale. Hale was silent for a moment when Ethan told him what had been found. Then he said, "That tracks with what we've been seeing on the financial side. Victor Langston still holds a significant block of silent shares. Non-voting, non-disclosed in public filings due to a structure that predates current transparency requirements. If Project Helios goes public, if the pharmaceutical connection becomes criminal, those shares are worthless. Everything he built his retirement on disappears." A pause. Graham isn't running this. Graham is being managed. He's a pawn, Ethan said. A well-compensated one who has enough involvement to make him complicit either way. Victor keeps his hands clean. Graham takes the exposure, and if it ever unravels, there's enough layering to slow any investigation for years. Hale paused again, until someone from the inside starts pulling the right files. Until Evelyn, Ethan said. Until Evelyn, Hale agreed. Graham found Ethan that evening. Not in the office. In the parking structure, which Ethan recognized with a brief and darkly ironic awareness as one of the same architectural categories that had killed the first Helios-connected employee. Graham was alone. He looked like a man who had been awake for too long and had run out of the energy required to maintain his surface presentation. "I want to talk," Graham said. "Talk," Ethan said. Graham leaned against a concrete pillar and said nothing for a moment, looking at the floor. The performance quality was gone. This was something else, something more unguarded than Ethan had ever seen in him. "Some decisions weren't mine," Graham said finally. "I want that on the record. Some of what went through my authorization chain. I flagged internally. I raised concerns. They were overridden." He looked up. "I'm not pretending my hands are clean. They're not. But I'm telling you that what's coming is bigger than me. And I have documentation of my objections." "Who overrode you?" Ethan said. Graham held his gaze for a moment. Then he looked away. "You know who." He pushed off the pillar and walked to his car without another word. The call about Evelyn came at 9 that evening. One of her monitors had spiked. A neurological response, the nurse explained, the first meaningful brain activity beyond baseline since she'd been admitted. Her body was fighting back against the sedation compound as the medical team worked to neutralize it. She wasn't awake, but she was reacting. Ethan received this news in his office and stood at the window for a moment, and what he felt was a complicated thing that he didn't try to name. 30 minutes later, the hospital administrator called with something else entirely. An anonymous communication had been received, the administrator explained, citing an insurance policy technicality, a clause related to the cost sustainability of maintaining treatment for patients without confirmed recovery prognosis. The communication was requesting formal review of continued care. It was bureaucratic language for something that was not bureaucratic at all. Ethan was in his car before the administrator finished the sentence. He drove to the hospital in under 12 minutes and went directly to the floor administrator's office and spoke, without raising his voice, in terms that were precisely clear about what he was authorizing financially and what he would do legally and publicly if any review of Evelyn's treatment was initiated under any pretense whatsoever. He left his business card and his attorney's direct line. He stood in the corridor afterward and let himself be angry for approximately 30 seconds, which was longer than he usually allowed. Then his phone lit up with a text from Detective Hale. For words, "Victor Langston just landed." Ethan walked back towards Zuri's room. She'd been moved to a supervised room closer to the nurse's station, Hale's arrangement, and he stopped in the doorway. She was asleep. Her braids had been redone by Naomi that afternoon, neat and careful, and she was curled on her side with one hand under her cheek. Her backpack was on the chair beside the bed, the way it always was close enough to reach. He stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at her. The broken zipper on her coat had been fixed. Naomi had noticed it and found a needle and thread somewhere in the hospital and sat in the waiting room and repaired it without being asked. Small things. The way families worked when they were working. He thought about what she'd said in the garden. He said, "My father sent him. I don't have a father." He thought about what he intended to do about that. He pulled the door halfway, closed, so the hallway light wouldn't wake her, and he walked toward the elevator with Hale's 4 words still on his phone screen, and the weight of what was coming settled into his shoulders like something he intended to carry. Victor Langston had landed. The man who had built everything, protected his own fortune over the bodies of people who'd gotten too close to the truth, and spent years keeping a young woman and her daughter away from the one person who might have actually helped them, was in the same city now for the first time since all of this started breaking open. Ethan pressed the elevator button and waited. Victor Langston walked into Callaway Technologies headquarters the next morning as though he still owned it, which in the ways that mattered most to him, he believed he did. He was 71, but he wore it the way old money wears age, with a kind of polished authority that made the years look intentional rather than accumulated. Silver hair, tailored charcoal suit, the unhurried pace of a man who had never once in his life needed to rush toward anything because everything had always arranged itself in his direction. Employees who recognized him from company history portraits straightened instinctively as he passed. The ones who didn't straighten anyway, responding to something in the atmosphere around him, the particular gravity of a person who has spent decades ensuring that rooms orient toward them. Even Graham, waiting near the elevator bank, looked relieved and nervous in equal measure. The look of a man who has been out on a limb and has just seen someone reach out a hand, but isn't entirely certain whether it's to pull him back or push him further. Victor shook Graham's hand warmly and said something low that made Graham nod. Then he looked down the corridor toward Ethan's office, and his expression held a perfectly arranged version of paternal concern. Ethan met him at the office door. Ethan. Victor's voice was the kind of voice that belonged in a boardroom or a courtroom. Resonant, measured, carrying the weight of long practice. He clasped Ethan's hand in both of his and held it a moment. I came as soon as I understood the situation. I should have come sooner. Come in, Ethan said. They sat across from each other, and for the first few minutes Victor talked about the company, about stability, about how institutions weather crises through steady leadership. The kind of speech that was simultaneously genuine-sounding and completely empty of anything specific. Ethan listened and let him finish. Then Victor said, there are people on the board who are frightened. Frightened people make reactive decisions. What you need right now is for someone with institutional authority to stand alongside you and signal continuity. A pause. I could do that, but it would help if you step back from the day-to-day oversight of this investigation. Let me manage the board relationship while you focus on the personal situation. His eyes held something careful. Your personal situation has become complicated. The word complicated did specific work in that sentence, and both of them knew it. You know about Zuri, Ethan said. Not a question. Victor's expression didn't change. I know that an employee's child has become entangled in what should be a straightforward internal matter. I know that your connection to the family has created the appearance of a conflict of interest. A small pause. I'm trying to help you protect yourself. From what? Ethan said. From decisions made in an emotional state that could cost you everything you've built. Victor leaned forward slightly. Step back. Temporarily. Let this settle. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. No, he said. The single word landed cleanly. Victor held his gaze, and something shifted in the older man's eyes, barely visible, like ice adjusting its surface under a change in temperature. He recovered in under a second. But Ethan had seen it. Think carefully, Victor said. I have, Ethan said. Thank you for coming in. Detective Hale had quietly upgraded the security arrangements around Evelyn's hospital room and the supervised space, where Zuri was staying the previous evening, before Victor's arrival. 2 officers, rotation schedule, nobody accessing either room without verified credentials. Hale had not explained this to Ethan as a precaution. He'd simply done it, which told Ethan something about how seriously Hale was taking the threat. Zuri noticed the officers on the second day. She asked Ethan about them that evening when he stopped by after the meeting with Victor. She was at her corner of the conference room, pencils arranged by color the way she always arranged them before she started drawing. Are those policemen because of my mom? She said. They're here to make sure everyone stays safe, he said. She thought about this. Are they here because of the man in the garden? Partly. She selected a blue pencil and turned it over in her fingers. She hadn't started drawing yet, which meant she was thinking. Is there someone who wants to stop her from waking up? He looked at her, 7 years old, sitting in a conference room chair with her feet not quite reaching the floor, asking the exact right question with the steady directness of someone who had decided that the truth, whatever it was better than the version adults constructed to protect her. Yes, he said, but we're not going to let that happen. She looked at the blue pencil. Then she put it down and picked up a black one. Okay, she said, and she started to draw. He watched her for a moment. She stopped smiling the way she'd sometimes smiled in the first days. The small, reflexive smile of a child who smiles to reassure adults around her. She wasn't doing that anymore. The situation had moved past the range where that kind of effort was useful, and she'd made a practical adjustment. He found this both impressive and quietly heartbreaking. Naomi came to find him that evening in the hospital corridor, and the look on her face told him before she said a word that whatever was coming had taken her effort to bring. She had called a contact from years ago, someone she wouldn't name, someone who had peripheral knowledge of the original agreement, the one that had been offered to her at her kitchen table in an envelope. Through this contact, She had confirmed something she had not been certain of until now. Victor Langston had not simply authorized the payment made to keep Naomi quiet. He had arranged it personally, had given specific instruction about the language used, the framing that made Evelyn's departure seem voluntary, that placed the liability for any future disclosure squarely on Naomi and Evelyn rather than on the company. But there was more. Victor had known about Ethan and Evelyn's relationship before it became serious. He had monitored it, watched it develop, and decided, with the particular cold logic of a man who viewed people as assets and liabilities, that Evelyn was a liability Ethan couldn't afford if Ethan was going to become what Victor had planned for him to become. Victor had removed her. Not cruelly, not with violence, at that point. Surgically. A pressure campaign delivered through intermediaries, a payout that looked like generosity and functioned like a lock on a door. He had separated them with the precision of a man pruning a tree, cutting off a branch he'd judged unnecessary. And then Evelyn had grown up and come back. He told me. Naomi said, quietly, standing in the hospital corridor with her hands folded, that my daughter would ruin his future. She corrected herself. His exact words were that she would ruin his future, meaning Ethan's. She looked at Ethan steadily. He said it like Ethan was his. Ethan stood with that for a moment. He thought he was protecting me, he said. He thought he was protecting his investment, Naomi said. There's a difference. The flashback came to Ethan that night, sitting alone in the consultation room after Naomi had gone. It came the way these things come when you're exhausted and no longer have the energy to keep the doors closed, clear and specific, and carrying the particular sting of things you should have understood at the time and didn't. Victor, sitting across from him 23 years ago, in a meeting that had seemed at the time like a gift. I see something in you. I want to build something with you. The deliberateness of the attention. The careful way Victor had shaped Ethan's ambition, redirected it, cultivated a specific kind of focus that left very little room for anything personal. How that had always seemed like wisdom at the time. How it had never been wisdom. It had been management. Graham found Ethan the following afternoon, not in a parking structure this time, but in the small side office Ethan had been using as a temporary base. He came in without knocking, closed the door behind him, and stood with his back to it. He looked like a man who had made a decision he wasn't fully comfortable with and had decided to execute it before his nerve failed. I want to give you something, Graham said. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. I objected to Helios in writing twice. Both objections were overridden by Victor. I retained copies outside the company's server. He put the document on the desk between them. I'm not asking you to believe I'm innocent. I'm not. But I'm telling you that I was not the architect of this, and I have documentation that supports that. Ethan looked at the document without touching it yet. Why now? Because Victor is here, Graham said. And when Victor is here, loose ends get managed. He met Ethan's eyes. I don't intend to be managed. There was something almost human in his face at that moment. Not quite remorse, not quite fear, but the look of a man who has been in service to something he knew was wrong for long enough that naming it out loud had become a kind of relief. Sit down, Ethan said. Hale's breakthrough came that evening, delivered by phone in the terse, efficient language Hale used when something significant had moved. The financial tracing had gone further than the shell companies. Beyond the offshore accounts, beyond the pharmaceutical procurement chain, the Helios funding had been used to finance what appeared to be unauthorized experimental pharmaceutical testing. Trials conducted outside standard regulatory frameworks, using compounds that had not cleared proper approval processes. The sedative found in Evelyn's system was not simply a procurement from the supply chain. It was a product of it. The scale of the liability, Hale said carefully, was significant. If proven, it would represent not just corporate fraud, but criminal endangerment. The kind of exposure that made everything else, the board maneuvering, the falsified documents, the payments to keep people quiet, look like defensive measures around much larger wound. This was what Helios actually was. This was what Evelyn had found. This was what Victor Langston had spent 4 years and an unknown number of lives protecting. The morning after Hale's call, he sat across from Zuri at the small table in the supervised room and told her she would be staying under protective custody for a little while longer. He told her this directly, because she was the kind of person who responded better to the truth than to a managed version of it, and he had worked that out by now. She received the information with the measured acceptance she brought to most things that weren't about her mother. Can I still see Grandma, Naomi? She said. Every day, he said. She nodded. Okay. Then she said, Can I ask you something? Yes. She looked at her hands on the table. Are you going to be around after this is over? Or do you go back to just being, she searched for the word, just being the other person? The question was quiet and precise, and it landed somewhere he hadn't fully armored. He sat with it for a moment, giving it the respect it deserved rather than answering quickly. "I'm not going back to being the other person," he said. "I'm going to be around." She looked at him with the careful, evaluating look of someone who has been given promises before and learned to weigh them. She didn't say she believed him, but she didn't dismiss it either. She picked up a pencil. He took that as what it was, the beginning of something, not the end. Victor had been working the media quietly and efficiently, the way he did most things. Nothing obvious, no press statements, no named sources. But the narrative had begun shifting in ways that Ethan could trace back to Victor's particular fingerprints. Suggestions surfacing in financial reporting circles that Callaway Technologies was experiencing a leadership instability crisis. Framing that positioned Ethan as emotionally compromised, personally entangled, a CEO navigating a conflict of interest. Nothing false enough to litigate. Everything damaging enough to erode. Two board members who had voted to delay the emergency vote called Ethan separately that week. Both conversations carried the same undertone. The board was being worked, and Victor's institutional authority was the instrument. Ethan noted all of it without reacting publicly. He let it accumulate. Graham came to him again, this time after hours when the building was mostly empty. He came with the slightly diminished bearing of a man who had already spent most of his defensive resources and was operating now on something closer to honesty. He told Ethan the thing he'd been withholding from the earlier conversation. Project Helios had not started under Ethan's tenure. It had been initiated by Victor in the final 2 years of his active chairmanship, before the transition to Ethan's leadership. When Victor stepped back, he had arranged for Helios to continue operating under cover of normal capital expenditure lines that ran through Graham's oversight, because Graham had been Victor's selection for CFO, placed there precisely because Victor trusted that Graham could be managed. "I was a safeguard for him," Graham said. He said it flatly, like someone describing a function. "If it ever came apart, I was the name attached to the authorization chain." He was 3 steps removed. "Did you know that from the start?" Ethan said. Graham was quiet for a moment. "I understood it by the 2nd year," he said. "I should have stopped it then." A pause. "I didn't." Ethan looked at him. There was no point in saying the obvious thing. Graham already knew the obvious thing. "If we go to a full board hearing with everything we have," Ethan said, "and I put the original contracts on the table, will you testify to what you just told me?" Graham looked at the desk. The pause was long enough to be honest rather than performative. Then he said, "Yes." Naomi brought Zuri a book from a shop near the hospital. Something with illustrated animals and a story about finding your way home that Naomi had clearly chosen with intention rather than convenience. Zuri received it with a gravity that matched the intention behind the giving, and the two of them sat together in the supervised room that afternoon and read it, Naomi's voice running through the pages while Zuri sat tucked against her side. Ethan passed the open doorway and saw them and kept walking. There were things happening in that room that didn't need an audience and didn't need to be named. They just needed to be allowed. The maintenance worker arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, carrying a work order for HVAC inspection in the ICU wing. He had credentials, a laminated badge, a clipboard, a company uniform, the specific confidence of someone who belongs in a service corridor. He made it as far as the hallway outside Evelyn's room. The officer on rotation stopped him, checked the credentials against the hospital's verified contractor list. The company name on the badge had a 1-letter variation from the actual contracted HVAC service. The kind of difference designed to survive a casual glance, but not a careful one. The man was removed from the building. He gave a name that proved false within the hour. Hale added it to the file. Ethan found Evelyn's safety deposit key in the envelope that had held the paternity test. It had been taped to the inner flap, easy to miss if you weren't looking carefully. He'd gone back to the envelope when he was organizing the documentation Naomi had provided and noticed it. The box was at a branch bank 4 blocks from the hospital. He went with an attorney present and opened it under proper documentation. Inside was a flash drive, different from the one Zuri had found under the pillow. Older, and a folded handwritten note in Evelyn's writing. "This one is the voice." The drive contained a single audio file. He listened to it that evening in his car, parked in the hospital structure, headphones in. Victor's voice was unmistakable. The recording was not perfect. Ambient noise, slightly muffled, the kind of quality that comes from a phone placed in a pocket, but it was clear enough. Victor spoke for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. He told Evelyn, in the careful language of a man who chooses words like weapons, that she had made a significant mistake in returning, that the agreement she had signed years ago remained binding, that the evidence she believed she had gathered was incomplete and would not survive legal scrutiny. That the most sensible thing, he used the word sensible 3 times, would be for her to take her daughter and leave quietly, because the alternative involved a level of exposure she was not equipped to withstand. And then, near the end, his voice shifted just slightly, not into anger, but into something colder than anger. He said, "You were always the wrong variable, Evelyn. I corrected it once. I'll correct it again if I have to." The recording ended. Ethan sat in the car for a long time. He went back to Zuri's room that night, later than usual. She was still awake. She slept badly when her mother's condition hadn't changed, which he had worked out by now. She was lying on her side with the illustrated animal book open in front of her, not really reading it, just keeping it near. She looked at him when he came in and didn't say anything right away. Then, "I thought she died," she said. Her voice was still quiet, still even, but underneath it, something had shifted and the steadiness cracked just slightly along that edge, the way a surface does when what's beneath it has been under pressure long enough. When she wouldn't wake up that morning, "I thought she was dead and I didn't know what to do, and I just put on my coat and I want to find you because I didn't know who else there was." She stopped. Her face did something complicated and then resolved back into stillness. Ethan sat on the edge of the chair beside the bed. He didn't immediately offer comfort or reassurance because she hadn't asked for those things. She had offered him a truth, and that deserved to be received before anything else. "That was the right thing to do," he said finally. "Coming to find me. That was exactly right." She looked at the book. "I was scared." "I know," he said. "You were scared and you came anyway. That's not the absence of bravery, Zuri. That's the whole definition of it." She was quiet. Then, very slowly, she leaned sideways until her head was against his arm, and he sat very still and let her, and outside the hospital window, the city moved through its evening, indifferent and ordinary, while inside that room something quiet and irreversible was being established. The call came at 11:14 that night. Ethan was in the corridor outside Evelyn's room when the monitor tone changed inside. Not the alarm tone, but the steady elevated pattern that indicated neurological activity. The nurse on duty moved fast. He stayed in the doorway. Evelyn's eyes opened. Not all the way. Not with immediate clarity. They open the way eyes open when someone has been a very long way away and is making the first difficult effort of the journey back. Slowly, with enormous effort. The light of the room clearly registering as something sharp and unwelcome after days of darkness. The nurse spoke her name, said it twice. On the 3rd time, Evelyn's eyes moved. She looked at the ceiling. Then, with what was visibly the full extent of her current capacity, she turned her head. Her lips moved. No sound for a moment. Then, barely above the threshold of audible, in a voice that carried the texture of extreme exhaustion and something that might have been relief. "Victor." 1 word. Then her eyes closed again, and the monitors settled back into the slower rhythm of medicated rest. But she had said it. 1 word, and it was the right word, and it was enough. Ethan called Hale at 11:17. Hale already knew. The hospital had a protocol for notifying the detective assigned to the case whenever the patient's status changed. He had gotten the call 30 seconds earlier. She said his name. Ethan said, "I know," Hale said. Across the city, in whatever hotel room or residence Victor Langston had installed himself in since his arrival, someone received a message. Ethan didn't know this for certain, but he understood how these things worked, the same way Evelyn had understood, the same way she'd hidden the flash drives and written the draft email and taped the key to the inside of the envelope. The people who ran systems like Victor's always had someone watching the things they couldn't afford to have surface. Within the hour, someone tried to access Evelyn's medical chart remotely. The attempt was logged and flagged by the hospital's security system, which Hale had arranged to monitor for exactly this kind of access. Hale sent Ethan a text at 12:02. His comm just cracked. The board hearing was called for 9 in the morning on a Thursday, 2 weeks and 1 day after Zuri had stood on a snow-covered porch and changed everything with 6 quiet words. Ethan arrived early. He set the original Helios contracts, the one signed by Victor Langston, found in the conference room drawer by a 7-year-old with better instincts than most of the adults in the building, at his place at the table. He set Graham's written objection documents beside them. He set a printed transcript of the audio recording beside those. Then he sat down and waited. The board members filed in. Victor came last, which was deliberate. The entrance of a man who had spent 50 years understanding that arrival timing is its own form of authority. He wore a dark suit and the expression of someone attending a proceeding they consider manageable. He nodded at Ethan across the table with something that might have passed for warmth in a different room. Ethan nodded back. Graham walked in 2 minutes after Victor. He did not sit on the side of the table. Victor spoke first, as he'd clearly arranged to do. He was composed and measured and authoritative. The voice of institutional history, of 50 years of building, of the kind of credibility that had been constructed so carefully over so long that it felt structural rather than performed. He presented his position with confidence. That the documents Ethan had been referencing were misattributed, that his signature on early Helios contracts reflected a preliminary concept that was later substantially altered under Ethan's administration, that the offshore financial structure was a legal tax optimization arrangement mischaracterized by investigators without full context. He was good. Ethan had always known he was good. When Victor finished, Ethan put his hand on the audio recording transcript and slid it to the center of the table. "I'd like the board to listen to something," he said. He pressed play on his phone. Victor's voice filled the room. "You were always the wrong variable, Evelyn. I corrected it once. I'll correct it again, if I have to." The room was very still. Victor did not move. His hands remained flat on the table, and his expression held for 2, 3 seconds. And then something in it gave way, the way a controlled structure gives way, not collapsing but settling visibly into a different configuration. What replaced the composure was not panic. It was something colder, the look of a man recalculating. That recording, Victor said, carefully, was obtained without consent, and its admissibility is being evaluated by law enforcement, Ethan said. Along with the original contracts, the shell company procurement chain, the pharmaceutical testing records, and the testimony of the CFO who was positioned to absorb your exposure. He looked at Victor steadily. "The board can vote today on whatever it chooses. But I want everyone in this room to understand what the complete picture looks like before they do." Graham's testimony lasted 40 minutes. He spoke without performance. No dramatic framing, no self-exoneration that wasn't earned. He described the origin of Helios under Victor's chairmanship, the structure that had been built to route accountability away from Victor and toward anyone whose name appeared in the authorization chain. The 2 written objections he had filed and that had been overridden, the payments to the pharmaceutical supplier, the nature of the compounds being developed. He described the 3 Helios-connected employees who had suffered fatal or near-fatal incidents when they'd gotten too close to what the project actually was. He placed his documentation on the table as he spoke, piece by piece, in the order that built the clearest picture. When he finished, the room was the particular quality of quiet that follows something that cannot be taken back. One of the board members, Sandra Oakes, who had been on the board for 11 years and who Ethan had always read as genuinely independent, looked at Victor across the table and said, with complete flatness, "Victor, is any of this inaccurate?" Victor looked at Sandra for a moment. Then he looked at Ethan. Then he looked at the table. He said nothing. Detective Hale secured the warrant that afternoon. Victor's financial accounts, personal and the layered corporate structures connected to him, were frozen pending the investigation. Hale moved on it quickly and quietly, the way he did things, without announcement or theater. He called Ethan from the courthouse steps. "It's done," he said. "His lawyers will file for a stay within the hour, but the freeze stands until the court decides otherwise. The pharmaceutical records are being subpoenaed. The shell company network is being mapped." A pause. "He's not going anywhere without it becoming very complicated for him very quickly." "Thank you," Ethan said. "Don't thank me yet," Hale said. "Thank me when it's fully prosecuted." Another pause, and when he spoke again, there was something different in his voice, not the measured professional tone, but something more direct. "What you did, keeping that child safe while this unraveled, making sure Evelyn's evidence didn't disappear, that mattered. I want you to know I saw it." Ethan didn't have an immediate response to that. "Do your job well, Hale," he said finally. "That's the thank you." Hale made a sound that might have been a short laugh. "Working on it." Evelyn regained full consciousness on a Friday morning, 8 days after her eyes had opened briefly and she'd said the single word that confirmed everything. She came back slowly, awareness surfacing in stages, the way it does after the body has been through something that takes more than days to fully process. The nurse on duty was the first to notice the change in her eye movement, the deliberate quality of it, different from the reflexive responses of the previous week. She called the doctor. The doctor spoke to Evelyn in measured, careful sentences, assessing orientation. Evelyn answered each question correctly, her voice low and rough from disuse but steady. Ethan was in the building when the call came. He was there in 4 minutes. He stood inside the door of her room and looked at her, awake, present, recognizing him. And for a moment he didn't say anything. There was too much accumulated in the silence for any opening sentence to carry it adequately. Evelyn looked at him with the dark, clear eyes he remembered, and said, "You found the envelope." "Yes," he said. She nodded slowly, like something she'd been uncertain about had resolved. And Zuri is safe. She's been here the whole time. He paused. She came to find me. The night you didn't wake up. She walked to my house in the snow. Something moved across Evelyn's face. Complicated, layered, the expression of a mother absorbing what her child had done in the worst moment. The pride and the grief of it arriving simultaneously. She pressed her lips together for a moment. Then, she would, he agreed. She told Detective Hale her full account that afternoon, Ethan present at her request. She described gathering the evidence over 8 months, accessing files she'd been able to reach as executive assistant, following the financial threads from the shell companies to the pharmaceutical supplier, finding the Helios project documentation buried in records 3 levels below standard access. She described the man who appeared in the hallway outside her apartment, whom Zuri had also identified. Graham, she confirmed. He'd come to warn her, not threaten her, which she'd understood but which hadn't changed what she was doing. She described Victor coming to the apartment. Not a man breaking in through a window. A man who knocked on her door at 7 in the evening and sat in her kitchen and drank the tea she made because she hadn't believed, even then, that he would cross the line she now understood he'd already decided to cross. He spoke to her for 20 minutes. He said the things she'd recorded. And then he asked if she'd like another cup of tea, and she declined, and he left. By midnight, she couldn't stay awake. By morning, Zuri couldn't wake her. Hale listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at her for a moment. You knew what you were doing was dangerous, he said. You did it anyway. I knew what he did to those other people, she said. I knew what would happen if someone didn't stop it. She paused. I had a lot of reasons to stop it. Hale glanced briefly at Ethan, then back at Evelyn. He didn't pursue the subtext. He closed his notebook. Your testimony combined with the recording and the physical evidence is enough, he said. I want you to know that. What you built over those 8 months. That's what this case stands on. Victor was arrested on a Saturday evening. There was no dramatic scene, no shouted accusations in a corridor, no public spectacle that the media could turn into something other than what it was. 2 officers arrived at the residence he'd been using and presented the warrant, and Victor Langston walked out of the building in a charcoal coat with his hands in front of him in the kind of composed, upright posture that had been his default setting for 7 decades. He looked at Ethan once, across the distance of the building's entrance, before the officers guided him forward. His face held, even now, the particular quality of a man who believed his own framing of events, who had convinced himself, somewhere in the long project of building and controlling and removing the wrong variables, that what he'd done was a form of stewardship rather than a sequence of crimes. He said, You were supposed to be greater than this. Ethan held his gaze without expression. He let the words pass. There was nothing to say to a man who still, in handcuffs, believed that the version of greatness he'd been cultivating in Ethan was the only version worth having. The legal proceedings moved with the deliberate, unglamorous pace of institutional justice actually functioning. Evidence was submitted, reviewed, challenged, sustained. Victor's legal team was expensive and thorough and accomplished exactly what expensive and thorough legal teams accomplish in cases where the evidence is solid. They slowed things, they complicated things, they found every procedural angle available to them. But they did not change the fundamental architecture of what had happened, because that architecture was documented, recorded, and testified to by a CFO who had decided that the cost of staying silent had finally exceeded the cost of speaking. Graham accepted a plea agreement in the 4th week after Victor's arrest. Full cooperation, complete documentation, testimony in the criminal proceedings. The agreement acknowledged his culpability. He had known, he had stayed, he had signed, while recognizing his cooperation as a material factor in the prosecution's strength. He sat across from Ethan one afternoon before the formal proceedings began in the same small conference room where so much of this had been worked through. He didn't try to frame what he'd done as anything other than what it was. He said only, I should have stopped it in year 2. I've had a long time to understand that, and I don't expect it to change anything. Ethan looked at him. It changed enough, he said. Whether that's redemption is above my pay grade to decide. Graham nodded once, and stood and left, and that was the last private conversation they had. At the company, Ethan stood before the full board and the senior leadership team 3 weeks after Victor's arrest and said the things that needed saying without qualification. He acknowledged that Project Helios had operated inside his company for 4 years without his knowledge, which was itself a failure of oversight that he accepted responsibility for. He acknowledged that the culture that had allowed someone with Victor's level of unmonitored influence to shape the company's internal structure had been built long before him, but had been maintained on his watch. He announced a transparency reform, external audit requirements, a restructured board nomination process, a whistleblower protection policy with genuine teeth rather than the decorative kind. He announced these things not as a public relations exercise, but as operational commitments with timelines and accountable parties. Some of the board received this well. Some received it less well. Ethan had passed the point in his understanding of himself, where those two groups' responses felt equally important. Evelyn's physical recovery moved faster than the doctors had initially projected, which her primary physician attributed, with a carefully professional neutrality, to the fact that she appeared to have a remarkable amount of motivation to get better. She was in physical therapy by the third week. She walked the hospital corridor with a therapist on one side and Zuri on the other, and the expression on her face during those sessions was one of quiet, sustained determination. Not dramatic, not performed, just the look of a person doing the necessary work. Naomi came every day. She brought food from outside. The hospital cafeteria had been evaluated and found insufficient, and she sat in Evelyn's room in the afternoons, and the conversations between them were sometimes difficult and sometimes quiet, and sometimes neither, and all of them were honest in a way that their relationship had not been for a long time. There was no single moment of reconciliation, no scene where everything was resolved and forgiven and set right. There were a series of smaller moments, each one building something that the single dramatic version could never have supported anyway. Evelyn said, one afternoon while Naomi was braiding her hair the way she had when Evelyn was small, "I know why you did it." Naomi's hands paused for a moment, then continued. "Knowing why doesn't make it right," she said. "No," Evelyn agreed, "but it makes it understandable. And that's somewhere to start." Detective Hale closed the Helios file officially at the end of the fourth week, turning the criminal case over to the prosecution team that would carry it through the courts. He came to the hospital on the last day, not officially, just to stop in. He found Ethan in the corridor, and they stood together for a moment with the comfortable silence of two people who had been through something without becoming friends exactly, but without remaining strangers either. "Career case," Ethan said. Hale considered this with characteristic evenness. "Career case," he agreed. Not because of the headline, because it actually meant something. He looked at the corridor. Somebody's kid walked through a snowstorm and knocked on the right door. That's not nothing. "No," Ethan said. "It's not." Hale left without ceremony, which was the right way for someone like Hale to leave. Zuri went back to school on a Wednesday morning in late March. The school was the same one she'd been attending before everything happened. Same classroom, same teacher, same small desk in the second row where she'd left off. Her teacher, a steady woman named Ms. Pruitt, had been briefed in general terms and had the good professional sense not to make the return into something requiring navigation. She simply said, "Good morning, Zuri," when Zuri came in, and Zuri said, "Good morning, Ms. Pruitt," and sat down, and the day began. Ethan drove her. He walked her to the classroom door and crouched down in the hallway outside it, and she looked at him with her backpack straps in both hands and her braids neat for Naomi's work that morning. "If anything feels wrong," he said. "I know," she said. "I have your number." "You have my number," he confirmed. She looked at him for a moment with that measuring look, the same one she'd used at the hospital, the same one she'd used in the conference room. The same one she'd been using since the night she'd found him on his doorstep with a decision already made and a small backpack and the specific courage of a child who knows what needs to be done and does it. Then she leaned forward and briefly put her arms around him, and he held her for a moment in the hallway outside the second-grade classroom, while around them the ordinary morning foot traffic of an elementary school moved and eddied and paid them no attention whatsoever. She pulled back, straightened her backpack, and walked into the classroom. He stood in the hallway for a moment after the door closed. Then he walked back down the corridor, out through the front entrance, into the March morning. The conversation between Ethan and Evelyn happened on a Saturday afternoon, 2 days after Zuri went back to school. They were in the small courtyard attached to the rehabilitation wing, the same enclosed garden where someone had once approached Zuri pretending to be a driver, which felt now like a different chapter of a story they were finally past. Evelyn was walking with a cane, which she treated as a practical instrument rather than an indignity. The sun was out for the first time in what felt like months. They talked about the practical things first, the legal proceedings, the company reforms, what would happen with the evidence. The things that were easier to talk about because they had clear shapes. Then the conversation slowed in the natural way it does when the practical things have been handled, and what remains is the thing underneath. "I didn't tell you," Evelyn said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at a patch of early crocuses pushing up through the dirt at the edge of the path. "I know the reasons I had. They were real reasons." She paused. but she deserved to have you know she existed. That was true regardless of what I was afraid of. He sat with that honestly, because she'd said it honestly. I wasn't the man she needed yet, he said. When you left. I don't know that I would have been. Maybe not. A pause. You are now. He looked at the crocuses too. I'm going to be whatever I need to be for her, he said. Whatever I need to learn, whatever needs to be built. I'm not going anywhere. He paused. And I'm not asking for anything from you. However you want to do this. Whatever pace makes sense. I'm not going anywhere. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. The sun moved on the garden. Somewhere above them a window opened, and the distant sound of Zuri's voice came down from inside the building. She was telling Naomi something animated, her voice carrying the particular energy of a child reporting good news about her day. Evelyn turned her face up toward the sound. The expression on her face was private and full and not something that needed to be described, only witnessed. She walked to your house, Evelyn said softly. In the snow. In the snow, he said, a silence that was not empty. I know, Evelyn said. Spring arrived the way it always does, not in a single moment, but in an accumulation of smaller ones, each almost unnoticeable on its own. The snow on the streets of the city retreated, then the ice, then the particular cold that had settled into everything since December. Trees that had stood bare for months began the slow business of becoming themselves again. The mornings came earlier. The light lasted longer. On a Saturday in April, the three of them walked in a park 2 blocks from the apartment on Clover Street. Evelyn moving without the cane now, Zuri several yards ahead on the path with the focused independence of a child who knows she's allowed to go ahead but shouldn't go too far, Ethan walking at Evelyn's pace beside her. Naomi had declined to join them, citing a prior appointment that was probably invented, which was an act of perception that Ethan had filed away with deep appreciation. Zuri stopped ahead of them and crouched down to look at something at the edge of the path. A beetle, it turned out, which she examined with total concentration before carefully redirecting it off the pavement and onto the grass with a twig. She stood, brushed her hands, and looked back at them. It was going the wrong way, she said, by way of explanation. Then she turned back to the path and kept walking. Ethan looked at her, this child who had walked through a snowstorm to knock on a stranger's door, who had handed over a flash drive without knowing what it contained, who had run from man in a garden and reported it calmly to security, who had sat in conference rooms and hospital corridors with a steadiness that had held long past the point where most adults would have stopped holding. And he understood that whatever he had thought he was building before all of this was the thing that mattered. Not the company, not the empire, not the version of greatness Victor Langston had tried to sculpt him into. This, the beetle redirected onto the grass. The path continuing. He and Evelyn walked on, and above them the sky was the particular clear blue that belongs only to early spring, and ahead of them Zuri moved through the light, and the story that had begun in the snow on a night in December had arrived, quietly and without ceremony, exactly where it needed to be. If the most dangerous person in the room turned out to be the quiet little girl nobody looked at twice, what does that say about all the people we've been overlooking? If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and stay close, because the next one might just hit even harder.